10 years ago on Sunday, the bright skies over Washington and New York were darkened by the spectacular, devastating terrorist attacks on the citadels and the substance of US power. The response of the United States was hardly less rapid or dramatic. It launched a global war of terror and wars of choice, firstly in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. The consequences have been momentous and are still unfolding. I'm Graham Hutchings, Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica, and I'm going to be discussing some of these issues 10 years after 9/11 and beyond with Nader Mousavizadeh, Chief Executive Officer of Analytica. Nader, let's start with something that I think can be said unequivocally, which is that Al-Qaeda is very much a diminished threat, and of course the United States has not suffered an outrage, anything like what happened in 9/11.
That's certainly true. And I think if we look back now over the last 10 years, the principal objective of any U.S. government in the 10 years, which is to secure the American homeland, has been achieved. I think the question a lot of people are asking is at what price? At what price in blood, at what price in reputation, at what price in standing in the world, and certainly at a time right now of quite serious financial constraints and crises around the world, at what price in economic standing?
The war in Iraq is in many respects over, but there's still questions about stability there. The war in Afghanistan is still going on, and despite proposed plans of withdrawal, the Afghan question is still pretty well open as far as it being a source of global stability. Isn't that right?
It certainly is open from the perspective of what the threshold for being able to leave is. I think for a lot of people, the question that is foremost on their minds is, so the initial intervention in Afghanistan was eminently justified by the fact that the Taliban had housed and supported and otherwise armed bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and provided the basis from which they were able to attack in the West. It was clear that the Taliban were so inextricably linked with bin Laden and his operation that they could not be separated, and they themselves made clear that they were not going to hand him over in any way. So that seemed both eminently justified, and if you think now back, certainly relative to the enormous investment, hundreds of thousands of troops, trillions of dollars, how quickly and easily the Taliban at the time was actually overthrown, it is very sobering to think that 10 years later, more than 100,000 Western troops are still in Afghanistan, and it is still unclear to a lot of people what the mission is. Is it counterterrorism or is it counterinsurgency? How do we get out? And if we get out, can we do so in a way that does not ultimately let the enemies of the project in Afghanistan, which is a more or less better governed, safe to itself and safe to the outside world country, can we leave that in relatively safe hands over the Taliban overrun Kabul within a very short period, as many fear?
We ought also to think about Pakistan in this connection, because of course it's been, the relationship between the United States and Pakistan has been very much a casualty of success of any kind in Afghanistan. The irony of Osama bin Laden being nailed down there, of course, is not lost on anybody. That relationship is in a bad way. Moreover, the integrity of the Pakistani state is a lot less healthy than it was 10 years ago.
Indeed, and I think one of the questions that a lot of people are asking is, is there really the only and best reason to stay in Afghanistan? Is it to really not for Afghanistan's own sake, but for the purpose of preventing it from becoming a source of fundamental instability beyond what is a very substantial instability every day in Pakistan? And maybe that's a justification for staying in Afghanistan, because right now I think a lot of people, observers, people who spend a lot of time on the ground and elsewhere, are having very serious doubts about the fundamental nation-building mission. And that comes to really a fundamental question about what the last 10 years have taught us also about the capabilities of the West in intervention. I think one of the things that is less talked about but more and more apparent is that Western forces and Western troops have become extremely capable of what is termed direct action in the business, which is about being able to eliminate and assassinate leaders of insurgencies and others. A much deeper and much more challenging question is, how good are we at nation building? How good are we at creating sustainable governance? And the kind of model that we came to Afghanistan with, which was to secure a centralized functioning government, was that really ever appropriate to a country that in so many ways remains far centuries behind.
That brings us really to the topic of Libya, I think, and the Arab awakening. It was one of the subtexts, and in fact not so much sub, of the global war against terror is that the Middle East would need to be remade in some way because it was the incubator of some of the Al-Qaeda type problems. In fact, what seems to have undermined the appeal, at least, of Al-Qaeda, as much as anything, is not the shock and awe of US military power on the ground, but the Tunisian fruit salesman whose life was lost in this cause, and we've seen this terrific upheaval. This is a landmark development, obviously, for a number of reasons, but the destination and the development of it is still very much open to question.
Very much so, and we see even most recently in Libya that the new constellation of forces seizing power in Tripoli certainly includes a range of actors, some of which one would have some questions about in terms of their own commitment to the kind of accountable, legitimate government that has been at the core of the aspirations of the young Arabs in the streets of the Arab world. I think it's also essential, I think, to see the Arab Spring nonetheless, for all the risks and for all the uncertainties around it, as the best answer to 9/11, far better than the killing of bin Laden himself. That is, the best answer to the outrages and to the attacks and to the nihilistic violence that 9/11 represented is an Arab indigenous movement for legitimate accountable government, which, by the way, wants a form of government which is both national, which is based on a representative elected government, both of which, of course, are anathema to Al-Qaeda's own ideology. Al-Qaeda wants nothing to do with the kinds of systems that the young in the Arab world are actually trying to promote today, which is why you see this interesting phenomenon, certainly in Egypt, of Al-Qaeda really having a very difficult time with its own Muslim Brotherhood movement, or the Muslim Brotherhood movement there, and what others from the outside might see as close relations. In fact, they are on very opposite sides of the future of that country.
I think we ought to consider the notion in the context of the past 10 years, but perhaps more particularly going forward, of strategic misperception and distraction, because the United States has waged this extraordinary war, to some extent with success and with good effect, but much bigger forces have been at work. They would have been so already, but they've gained in momentum and they've become more conspicuous for the fact that the United States has taken its eyes off this particular ball, the ball here being the extraordinary growth in power, political, economic primarily, but political as well, of the developing world, of China, of Brazil, of India. That world is being remade with enormous implications for business, for politics, for diplomacy, and the United States is not well prepared for it, and injured by its own severe economic difficulties.
I think one of the points you made there about these are, of course, trends that were existing before 9/11. Much of what has happened and much of the cost of the campaign against Al-Qaeda globally has been to accelerate what were already existing trends out of the BRIC countries, the economic growth, and the increasing political influence they have. That said, I think it's important for all of us sitting now with the perfect 20/20 vision that hindsight provides, that for anyone who was in New York in that day, as I was, and I was working in the UN building at the time, my wife was working downtown, the shock of that day, the shock of the attack, the nature of what that did to the fabric of that society on that day was really quite tremendous. And I think it is simply humanly unfair for us, I think, to underestimate the degree to which a society attacked in that way would have to take some measures in response, in defense of what it held and holds dear. And so, yes, have there been costs? Absolutely. Has it been in many ways a strategic distraction from the rise of China, etc.? No doubt. But, men and women and societies don't live by strategic calculations alone. And an attack of the kind that we saw on 9/11 on, individual citizens, people working in office towers, men, women, children, was of a kind that very few societies, I think, would have an easy time simply looking at in a very dispassionate, strategic way, but would have to be, again, as human nature is, be part of a response that would also be about defending itself, strengthening its defenses, and making sure that the principal objective of any society, which is to protect its citizens, is maintained.
That's right. The rise of China is very much one of the focuses that people have adopted in understanding the last 10 years and projecting that forward. And undoubtedly, from a certain realistic perspective, the Chinese have been the net benefiters of what's happened. However, it's often forgotten perhaps how embedded into the global framework China is, how dependent it is on that, how dependent in many ways it is on the United States for all sorts of reasons, and what is sometimes neglected, how dependent it is on Europe for markets and for other things. And Europe has had a very difficult 10 years. This has somewhat been overlooked in the broad sweep of things, but it's very much at the centre of our concerns at Analytica. And when you remember 10 years ago what promise Europe held, it had just launched monetary union, we'd had the Lisbon agenda about making the continent the most competitive centre of economic life on the planet. There was a lot of hope there. That has dwindled very dramatically, and that's nothing to do with bin Laden.
Indeed, and I think it's a very interesting lesson and perspective as we look now, as you say, much focused on the cost to the United States, the extension, the overextension of its military and economic responsibilities beyond what it clearly was able to afford in any sensible way. But you would have imagined and could have expected that Europe actually would have been a net beneficiary of that, that its soft power, frankly, that its ability to be a magnet for other societies in terms of how it's created an open and broad community of trade, of development, of technology. But we're seeing, as you say, a Europe that in fact is likely to become, I think, more fragmented and find increasing difficulties because the fundamental proposition of the euro, I think, by all accounts, has failed.
Let's turn finally to the question of the future of international organisations and their role, international leadership, international ideas. There's a bit of a paucity of all of those. One of the characteristics of the world as we see it unfolding before us is that it's very unclear who's in charge.
Well, that's something I think we're going to have to get used to. I don't think we're going to see leadership of the kind that we've seen in the past from international organizations. It has to do with structural issues with some of these organizations. It has to do with people and leaders, certainly as well. But it has to do with the way power is fragmenting around the world and the inevitable, certainly relative decline of the United States from a position of unique power just after the end of the Cold War, and the growth in emerging markets, their increasing capability to set the global political, economic setting has really changed, I think, the ability of any one country to set the tone. So we're not, I think, going to see the United States reemerge as one leader. We're not going to see Europe. We're going to get used to a world in which there are multiple centers of influence and power, much more of a scramble than one clear voice speaking on a global basis on behalf of everyone, given how disparate and increasingly fragmented individual countries' interests are.
Nader, thanks very much. I do hope you've enjoyed this discussion. One of the highlights of the Oxford Analytica year opens on Wednesday, our Global Horizons 2011 annual conference. We shall have speakers such as Robert Rubin, Kofi Annan and David Miliband, and we'll be discussing the sort of things we've been airing over the last 10 minutes and many others. We'll be posting video and other information on this site as that conference unfolds. I do hope you'll find time to look at it. In the meantime, thanks again and goodbye.